Why was Paul speaking of fulfilling the law several years after it had been annulled? Romans 13:8-10. There is no doubt that the law of Moses was annulled when Jesus died on the cross. Romans 7:1-6, Colossians 2:13-14, Hebrews 9:15-17, 10:9. Yet in Romans 13, Paul states, "Owe no man anything, save to love one another, for he that loveth his neighbor hath fulfilled the law." Romans 13:8. For this thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is summed up in this word, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Love therefore is the fulfillment of the law. Romans 13:9-10. The commandments Paul lists here were certainly part of the old law, Exodus 20:13 and following, including the command to love one's neighbor as oneself, Leviticus 19:18. If the law of Moses has been done away with, why does Paul reference it and speak of fulfilling it? Understanding fulfilling the law in context. Paul is not referring to fulfilling the law of Moses specifically, but rather to fulfilling law in general, the moral law of God that has always been binding upon humanity. This distinction is evident in the Greek text, where the definite article is absent, meaning that fulfilled the law could be rendered fulfilled law. This phrase does not indicate the reinstatement of the Mosaic law, but instead emphasizes a timeless moral principle. Love fulfills the requirements of God's law concerning human relationships. Moral law before and after Moses. The moral principles Paul cites were not exclusive to the law of Moses. These principles predated it and were later incorporated into the law of Christ. For example, the commands against murder, adultery, and theft are not merely Mosaic laws, but universal moral truths that apply to all people, regardless of covenantal period. Paul's citation of these commandments does not mean that the Mosaic system is still in effect. Rather, it illustrates that the core moral teachings of the Old Testament remain binding under Christ's law. Just as these commands were expected of the Israelites, they are still expected of Christians today. Not because the Mosaic law is in force, but because they reflect God's eternal moral standards. Paul's emphasis on love as the fulfillment of law is key to understanding his message. Love encompasses all moral duties. Jesus summarized the entire law in two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor. Love naturally leads a person to fulfill the moral obligations required by God. Love as motivation leads to obedience. If one genuinely loves others, they will naturally refrain from harming them, whether by committing adultery, stealing, or engaging in other forms of wrongdoing. Love is timeless. While specific legal codes such as the Mosaic law have been annulled, love remains a universal and eternal principle that governs how we interact with others. As Paul states, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfillment of the law. Romans 13:10. While Christians have been discharged from the law of Moses, we remain under the law of Christ. 1 Corinthians 9:21. This law includes all that God has always required concerning the proper treatment of others, now centered on the principle of love. Thus, Paul's statement about fulfilling the law in Romans 13:8-10 does not suggest that the Mosaic law remains in effect. Instead, it underscores that love is the guiding principle in all moral obligations. Love ensures that the essential moral commands of God, commands that transcend dispensations, are kept. Through love, Christians naturally fulfill what God requires in our relationships with others, just as He has always intended.